Welcome, age of vintage society. An alluring blonde with a husky come-hither voice, Lizabeth Scott was a leading lady of film noir during the genre's peak years in the late 1940s and early 50s, but scandal drove her from the public eye after only a few years on screen. Why was Lizabeth Scott constantly compared to Lauren Bacall? Make sure to watch the video until the end and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you're new here, join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Age of Vintage channel. Lizabeth Scott. Not just the B-movies Lauren Bacall. They called it film noir, a French term that means black cinema. It referred to the dark and downbeat feel of American crime dramas that were being released after the war. They were peopled by hard-boiled detectives, disillusioned cops and desperate men. The one bright spot in many of these films was a pretty girl or two. Sometimes the pretty girl would be a damsel in distress, but more often she was a femme fatale. Of course it was all an act, and many actresses coveted femme fatale roles because they took them out of a goody-two-shoes career path that the studio system set them on. A few seemed destined to play the bad girl roles, and it helped to sell tickets if there was some real-life scandal to spice things up. Lizabeth Scott was said to have the most beautiful face of film noir. She is most often compared to another beauty, her contemporary Lauren Bacall. Scott's and Bacall's careers paralleled one another in many ways. Both studied acting in New York and turned to fashion modelling to make ends meet. Both were slender blondes known for their husky voices, who would make it big in Hollywood thanks to the support of older men who became infatuated with them. Her sultry good looks and smoky voice helped Lizabeth Scott become the leading femme fatale of film noir movies during the 1940s and 50s. She made more than 20 films, including Dead Reckoning with Humphrey Bogart, I Walk Alone opposite Kirk Douglas, and Bad for Each Other with Charlton Heston. Promoted by Paramount as a femme fatale in the Lauren Bacall or Veronica Lake mould, her career never matched theirs in regard to role or project, but she proved herself to be a capable scene stealer and eye-pleasing presence in thrillers like The Strange Loves of Martha Ivers, The Racket and Dark City. Tabloid allegations left her star tarnished in the mid-1950s, and she vanished from the screen for the next half-century, save for an appearance in 1972's Pulp. Though largely forgotten by the general public, her steamy presence made her a favourite among armchair detectives and other fans of classic film noir. To be honest, when I was first introduced to the films of Lizabeth Scott years ago, I thought of her as a B-list Lauren Bacall. As I saw more of her films, I regretted giving her that label which, unfortunately, was a bias Scott had to deal with throughout her career. My favourite of her films is The Strange Love of Martha Ivers, featuring Barbara Stanwyck, Van Heflin, Kirk Douglas and Lizabeth Scott as ex-convict Tony Madacek. I also admire Lizabeth's performances in films such as Dead Reckoning, Desert Fury and Too Late for Tears. I won't go into my usual spiel. You can read excellent summaries of her career in her obituaries. Instead, I always find it fun to dip into the newspaper archives and see how the stars were viewed when they first caught the public's eye. Before she came to Hollywood, the former Emma Matzo of Scranton, Pennsylvania, as the daughter of John Matzo and his wife Mary, there have been multiple conflicting accounts as to her parents' ethnic origins, with most mentioning English, Russian and Ukrainian. Her family lived in the Pine Brook section of Scranton, where her father owned Matzo Market. Scott characterized her father as a lifelong Republican, which influenced her own capitalistic views. The family was immersed in all things cultural, especially music. This love of music influenced Scott's voice. At the age of 11, Scott played the fairy godmother in Cinderella at summer camp. During Christmas season, she took part in pageants at the local Catholic church her family attended. When asked what was the best advice she was given, Scott replied, "I don't know, but I sure didn't take it." Her mother told her to subdue her emotions and be a lady, but despite a strict Catholic upbringing, Scott described herself as having been rebellious and outspoken as a young girl. However, Scott mentioned adolescent favourites such as Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays as having the greatest influence on her. She made a name for herself on the stage, even if that name was constantly changing, from Emma to Elizabeth to the unique Lizabeth. She was the oldest of 6 kids, grew up in an environment steeped in all things cultural and musical. In the 1st grade she went to an elocution school which broke her from her northeast Pennsylvania dialect and helped her to develop a mid-Atlantic accent. Her deep voice she attributes to genetics. Her sisters shared her deep tone. Her mother wanted her to become a journalist, but the teenage Scott was adamant she would become an actress, or a nun. When her mother heard that, she relented. After appearing in summer stock as a teen and moving to New York to train in the theatre, 18-year-old Scott got cast in the travelling company of Helza Poppin, a musical revue written by former vaudevillians Olson and Johnson that was a huge success. She stayed with that play for over a year and then returned to New York, where she joined an off-Broadway theatre company, appearing in several plays, including a starring role as Sadie Thompson in Rain. That led to her biggest break yet, getting cast as Tallulah Bankhead's understudy, Tallulah was not pleased, in Thornton Wilder's new play, The Skin of Our Teeth. Scott recalled her prickly relationship with Bankhead in a 1945 interview. "I was sitting backstage and Tallulah looked at me and said, 'Close that door.' Being the meek little understudy, I closed it. Couple of nights later, Tallulah again said, 'Close that door.' Lizabeth said, 'Say please, Miss Bankhead.' Tallulah didn't say please. Lizabeth didn't close the door. Tallulah glared. Lizabeth glared back. They didn't speak for weeks. Finally, Lizabeth said, my uncle came to see the show and wrote me a note in which he glowingly praised Tallulah's performance. I showed it to her. That did it. We've been friends ever since." Lizabeth ultimately quit her understudying gig, but was called back when actress Gladys George suddenly left the production. The producer begged Lizabeth, on the eve of her 21st birthday, to return to the show in George's part as Sabina the Maid. She proved to be a big hit. Theatre critic Lawrence Dame witnessed Scott's performance. "I saw Lizabeth Scott play Sabina Wednesday night. She did a magnificent job, supple in a role that calls for much body swishing, full of earthly vitality and exciting, intriguing gestures, with a voice that you had to get used to at first, but one that amply revealed the emotional, poetic, highly intelligent spirit of the girl. Her Sabina did more than any other part to illuminate the play and stress what Thornton Wilder had in mind when he wrote it. No lines were missed, no subtlety overlooked." Hollywood soon came calling, specifically producer Hal Wallis, who had just left Warner Brothers for Paramount and was determined to find a star to match Warner's new discovery, 20-year-old Lauren Bacall, who was a sensation in her first film, To Have and Have Not. Let's face it, it was hard not to compare Lizabeth and Lauren. They had similar looks and similar unusually low voices. Both had been models in New York and both had appeared on the cover of Harper's Bazaar. "Prepare for the huge build-up of Lizabeth Scott," columnist Sheila Graham bellowed in May 1945. The story behind this story is the feud between Hal Wallis and Jack Warner. When Hal left the Warner studio, he was determined to find and build up a star to match the studio discovery Lauren Bacall. He picked Scott, who was once understudy to Tallulah Bankhead. Like Lauren, Lizabeth will sing in her first movie. Like Lauren, she has a low, husky voice. Only with her it's natural. Lauren had to acquire hers. Wallis is now in New York with 2,000 sultry photographs of the sexy Lizabeth Scott, and these will be planted in newspapers and magazines in one of the biggest publicity campaigns ever given a new star. Lizabeth was allowed to sing in her first picture, a post-war screwball comedy, You Came Along, in a role written for Barbara Stanwyck. Paramount's publicity department made the most of the song by billing Scott as The Threat, implying the danger her Hollywood career would have to the body, Mary MacDonald, the voice, Sinatra, and the look, Lauren Bacall. Scott hated the title but admitted that bad girl roles came easier for her. Wallis took a more active interest in Scott's image in her next film, The Strange Loves of Martha Ivers, this time co-starring with Barbara Stanwyck. Producer Wallace supposedly insisted that some scenes be reshot to better highlight his protégé. In The Lady from Shanghai, Lizabeth was cast opposite her supposed rival's husband, Humphrey Bogart. Both Rita Hayworth and Bacall had turned down the role. Both Bacall and Scott would make Bogey's list of 9 most potent kissers in movie scenes. Scott shared a hard-boiled quality with other actresses who emerged in the 40s, such as Ida Lupino, Lana Turner, Rita Hayworth, Bacall and Anne Sheridan. They were a step beyond the wise-cracking platinum blonde of just a few years previous, with a sharp sense of fashion and an air of, I don't really need a man, toughness. With films like Desert Fury, I Walk Alone, Pitfall and Too Late for Tears, Lizabeth solidified her title as the Queen of Noir. However, although she continued to work steadily, she and Wallace squandered opportunities to solidify her hold on stardom through the 1950s. In 1957 she starred with Elvis Presley in Loving You, after which she retired from movies. She later recalled, "Out of the clear blue sky one morning I woke and decided that I never wanted to make another film again. It was just a spark. I can't explain it." Scott was usually better than her parts and films. She possessed all the qualities being written about her in and throughout today's media. The Coastal Times newspapers predictably peg her as a film noir actress, including the sexual intensity, the intelligence, the voice, the slightly androgynous air, and the unaffected, tough exterior embedded with the will to submit at her discretion. She wore Edith Head's glamorous costumes well, and she was radiant, though she was rarely given the role in which to shine. She almost always added depth and at least brightness to the screen. She makes her films, which are mostly mediocre, worth seeing. She lived alone in the Hollywood Hills, evoking one of Scott's heroines, screen legend Greta Garbo, and, throughout her career, she was an individualist, which left her open to ridicule and innuendo, having once expressed that she wore men's cologne and pyjamas and confessed that she hated frilly dresses. As a leading lady in film noir and noirish pictures, Lizabeth Scott, who had co-starred with Burt Lancaster, Humphrey Bogart, Alan Ladd, Robert Mitchum, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, Michael Caine and with Charlton Heston in his film debut, was finished. She withdrew from movies, focusing on occasional television appearances, a musical recording career and auditing philosophy courses at the University of Southern California. She was constantly compared to the late Lauren Bacall, another sultry, smoky-voiced actress from the same era in movies, but I think Miss Scott might have been the better actress, with wider range and a more compelling presence on screen. I mean no disrespect to Bacall, whom I appreciate in pictures such as Howard Hawks's To Have and Have Not and The Shootist with John Wayne. It is too bad that Scott is remembered as an early film noir prototype and not much else. The term femme fatale does not do her justice. Sadly, it is too late for that now. I think that it is possibly still too soon for Lizabeth Scott, and that the world is possibly not yet ready for the actress she might have become. But I experienced firsthand that Lizabeth Scott was ready for the world and on her own terms, and this is a grand lifetime achievement. I feel bad that the talented actress had to deal with constant comparisons to Bacall. While she starred in many well-regarded film noirs, she never really enjoyed Lauren's level of success. I'm doing it again. Other films of note include The British Stolen Face, a 1952 precursor to Hitchcock's Vertigo, the Dean Martin Jerry Lewis film Scared Stiff in 1953, and the political Silver Load in 1954, which many saw as an anti-McCarthy film. Scott also appeared on live television during the 1950s, but her stage fright began getting the best of her. Her name became mired in scandal when Confidential magazine alluded to the fact that the unmarried Lizabeth Scott was active in Hollywood's underground lesbian community. She sued for $2.5 million, but the outcome was never made public, and it was settled out of court. Some say that scandal had a big part in Scott's retreat from the limelight. The scandal, however, was nearly ruinous. She made only 2 more films in the 1950s. Her final film role was opposite Elvis Presley in Loving You, in which she played a ruthless publicist who wants to make a star out of country bumpkin Elvis. Scott is definitely the older woman in the film, at the ripe old age of 35. She did make one more brief appearance in front of the camera in 1972's Pulp, starring Michael Caine. Lizabeth Scott is gone. She was 92. The actress, who reportedly died in Los Angeles on January 31st, was striking, talented and unjustly undervalued and underemployed in Hollywood, where she was viciously smeared. But she was both luminous and, in a way, premature for a world that matched her ability. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you are new here, and if you want to support my work, please visit my Patreon page. If they've been compared so often, find out now. Who destroyed Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart's marriage? Watch this video.